Right, okay, today we're going to be looking through the essay plans for biopsychology. So just a quick caveat or a mention on these: use these essay plans with great caution. The information that you use in the exam must be tailored to the question. Don't just assume that using these essay plans, if you remember them off by heart, that you will get all the marks that you need. That is not the case. Chances are, if you just wrote about everything you knew about the topic without tailoring it to the question or answering the question, you wouldn't get above grade 2 out of 4 within the way that we mark the essays. And of course, if you ever see the phrase in this study, you must apply that your knowledge to that scenario. It is absolutely vital that you do that, okay? So all of these essay plans you need to use carefully. Use them as a starting point, but do be aware in the exam, absolutely none of the questions will be as simple as just writing the information down without tweaking it and referring back to the question and tailoring it very, very carefully. Okay. So first of all, you've got localization of functioning of the brain, which is really important that you don't confuse with lateralization. So localization is the idea that specific functions have specific locations in the brain, and we talk about that a lot. You're all very well versed in the language centres, which is reassuring. So you would start with a brief definition of what localization is, a brief explanation, the idea that previously it was the holistic view that the brain activity, the whole of the brain was required for every single bit of activity that we did. And then of course there's the experience with Gage, so the rod that he was working on went through his skull and damaged part of his brain. Now if the holistic theory was true, then he wouldn't be able to function in any way. Because as part of his brain had been damaged, and according to the holistic theory, all of the brain is required for activity, whereas that wasn't the case, which suggests got psychologists to start thinking about the idea of localization, so the idea that certain things were affected in Gage's brain, sort of his behaviour, so clearly that was his, that part of the brain was damaged, which caused that change in behaviour, so not being so good at planning, very impulsive, change in personality. So those parts of the brain were damaged, and we did find that it was his frontal cortex, the frontal lobes that were damaged, which do link to those functions. Okay. And then you could talk about several different areas within the brain and how they are localized, so they have specific functions attached to them. For example, you've got the motor cortex, which is responsible for voluntary motor movement, so any movements that you choose to make are controlled in the motor cortex of the brain, which is in the frontal lobes of the brain along the precentral gyrus, and then there is a motor cortex in both hemispheres of the brain, which you know is important because the right side controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Then you've got the somatosensory cortex, which detects sensory events within the body. So any information that's coming from the skin, the reason you know it's too hot, the reason you know it's too cold, any pain that you experience, all of that is linked to this part of the brain, and that's in the parietal lobe of the brain along the postcentral gyrus. And exactly as it said, we uses sensory information from the skin and other sense organs to understand what's happening. And once again, that's in both hemispheres of the brain, with the right side of the brain processing and understanding information from the left side of the body, and so on. Then you have the visual centres, which are located in the occipital lobe, so you think of occipital in relation to optician, anything like that. And the idea is the information goes through the retinas in your eyes, through photoreceptors, into the optic nerve, into the brain, into the thalamus, and then into the visual cortex itself, so the information is refined down. And again, this spans both hemispheres of the brain, with the left side of the hemisphere, or the left hemisphere, dealing with information from the right field of vision. And remember, that's really important. It's not just the right eye, it's the field of vision. So if there's damage in the right hemisphere, it could lead to blindness in the left visual field of both eyes. Okay, so damage to that part of the brain doesn't necessarily make the whole of one eye go blind, or being unable to process that information. It just means that it could just be the left field of vision is affected if the right in both eyes is affected, if the right side of the brain is damaged, and so on. And then you've got the auditory centres, so they process auditory information, and they can be found in the temporal lobes on both sides of the brain in the auditory cortex. And the idea is the cochlea is in the inner ear, and that takes the information to the auditory nerves, very similar to the retinas and the photoreceptors taking it to the optical nerve in the visual centre. That goes to the brain stem, and then to the thalamus, which is a relay station, and then finally to the auditory cortex. And information about both of those processes are detailed in your textbooks as well. Mentioning about your textbooks also reminds me, don't just rely on the information that is here. Don't forget you have the scanned A3 sheets from both the cat book from last year and the green and pink haired girl, and they will be in your email, so if you check for those, that detail should be there. And actually your booklet should be more than capable for you to rely on, so all the information, if you filled it incorrectly in class, will have all the detailed information that you need as well. Okay. And then finally we can move on to the language centres, which is the last one we could talk about. And you've got Broca's area, which is linked to speech production, and Wernicke's area, which is linked to understanding speech. So we had Broca, who was a psychiatrist, psychologist in the 1800s, who looked at a patient called Tan, who couldn't speak or write down any information. And Broca, after Tan died, he did a post-mortem, and he found that in the posterior position of the portion of the frontal lobe on the left hemisphere was damaged. And Broca came up with the idea that was because that's where language production was localised. So he was the first one to start truly thinking about localisation as a concept, and it also involves other cognitive tasks such as maths performance. So it'd be interesting to see if people with damage in that part of the brain, damage with speech production, also struggle with other cognitive tasks as well. And the motor region of Broca's area is near the area that controls the mouth and the jaw. So someone who has damage in Broca's area can't produce speech, however they can still do things like chew and swallow. If you ask them to open and close their mouths, they can do all of those things. But the idea is, because in the brain they are very, very close together, that there could be some kind of link between those two. So they can still do voluntary movements with the jaw, but they can't necessarily do the fine motor movements required to produce speech, so to control their tongue and their jaw quite that fully. And then somebody who has a damage in Broca's area is thought to experience production aphasia or expressive aphasia, and aphasia just means loss of, essentially. And they have difficulty producing grammatical sentences, and their speech is very limited. And then you've got Wernicke's area, which is based on understanding speech. So you've got which is in the posterior portion of the left temporal lobe. So both of these are localised to one hemisphere, whereas all the others, they were localised specific functions within the brain, and they were mirrored on both sides of the hemispheres. This one, that's not the case. It's only based on it's only based in one hemisphere. So you can still talk about Broca and Wernicke in localisation or lateralisation, but you just have to do it very, very carefully. Someone with damage in Wernicke's area has receptive aphasia. So whereas it's expressive aphasia in Broca's area, so they struggle to express things, in Wernicke's area it's receptive aphasia. They struggle to understand information. So they struggle to understand language in any form, both spoken and written. And the same thing again, this Wernicke's area is close to the part of the brain responsible for visual and auditory input, so potentially there's some kind of damage to some kind of link there, or there's some kind of issues around that. Okay. And then we have the different strengths and weaknesses you could talk about, so always remember to use the P structure on these, make it really, really clear, and even a link back at the end. So always link it, think about the question, always link it back to the question. So we've got strength of the localisation theories, the supporting evidence from brain scans, and supporting research from Peterson himself, who conducted some research and found that during a listening task, when scanning the brain, Wernicke's area was activated, and during a reading task where they had to read out loud, Broca's area was activated. So in the example you would just state the findings, exactly what is found, and then you'd explain why that was a strength. So this is a strength because it suggests that Broca's area is used in the production of speech, because it lit up when only producing speech, and Wernicke's area is involved in understanding language because it was only activated when doing a listening task, which involves processing and understanding information. Then link it back to localisation, and that supports the idea of localisation theory, suggesting that different parts of the brain control certain functions. Okay, so it's more of the Peel structure, but it's a really useful one to use. Then you have evidence from neurosurgery or neurosurgical evidence with another piece of research, so neurobrain surgical surgery. So we've also got research from from when people have conducted brain surgeries that supports the idea of localization. So we got Doherty in 2002 found that 1/3 of patients with OCD who had received a procedure that involved lesioning the Klinke-Gate gyrus, or possibly close to that. You have a look in your booklets for the correct spelling. Responded positively to treatment. So 1/3 of patients with OCD who had a certain part of their brain lesioned, which means cut or damaged so it couldn't work, then they found a reduction in their OCD behaviours. And it's a strength because it suggests that some mental health needs and some certain behaviours, such as OCD, are controlled by specific parts of the brain. So of course the brain at that point is displaying abnormal, if you think back to psychopathology, abnormal behaviours, but they're clearly controlled by a specific part of the brain. So that part of the brain might be experiencing a surge in activity or a reduction in activity, and by damaging or stopping that part of the brain from working, it reduces the symptoms that someone with OCD experiences. And again, this supports localization theory, suggesting that different parts of the brain control certain behaviours. Then we have equipotentiality theory, which is a competing theory with localization. It's the idea that basic functions are localized, so motor movement, sensory movement, processing visual and auditory and language information is localized to certain parts of the brain, but actually more complex functions are holistic, so very complex things draw on a variety of different parts of the brain and use the whole of the brain. And if there's damage to that part of the brain, then it will kind of reduce the effectiveness of brain of processing in the brain, I suppose. And then we've got Lashley, who found there was no particular part of the rat's brain was more or less important for learning to run a maze. So they would assume the research they conducted, they would lesion certain parts of the brain, and they found there was no impact on learning in any way for any of those parts that were lesioned. And this is a weakness because it suggests that a variety of parts of the brain are needed to complete complex higher order thinking, such as learning. So if there was a certain part of the brain that was damaged and learning was reduced, that would have supported localization, that certain parts of the brain control different behaviours, so learning being behaviour, but actually they didn't find that. They found that no particular part of the brain was involved, so therefore it must be the brain must be drawing on several different parts to support learning. And then final weakness is that language production isn't confined to Broca's area, and this is in the cat book in the scan. So we've got Dronker, who conducted an MRI scan on 2 of Broca's patients and found that other parts of the brain might have experienced damage as well. And this is a weakness that suggests it's not only Broca's area which controls language, a high complex function, but there are several parts of the brain are as important. So this kind of can link back to the previous theory that we talked about. If it was only, or it does call into effect concerns around cause and effect. So if it's only Broca's area that was damaged, we saw Tan's experience expressive aphasia, then we would be confident it was Broca's area was the only thing causing that. However, because scans later on then showed that other parts of the brain were also damaged, that calls into question the idea that it's only Broca's area that's involved in language production, and actually is it several different parts of the brain that need to be working effectively to have appropriate speech and language production, or not working as effectively to cause those kind of deficits that we saw in Tan as well. And then if that's the case, it goes against the localization theory and kind of supports the epipotentiality theory as well. Okay.